First of all, I would say from my standpoint that there are some African Americans that are African, but from my take and my family and many others, we don't identify with having to come from Africa. I have no ties to Africa, none whatsoever, with the past 13 generations that I can name on my mother and father's side, my ancestors. I can't find any African in that link back to that time. So having said that, no. But what most people don't understand is Native American slavery. And Native American slavery was 200 to 300 years ahead before the first African hit these shores. Most folks don't understand that because they're given the perception that Indian owned slaves, and they show you the Cherokees owning slaves. But what they don't say, one of the major Cherokee slave owners, John Ross, they said was 1/8 or 1/64 Cherokee. So if you ask me, if I calculate that up, that is a Caucasian. According to his history, he could not even speak Cherokee. So folks must understand the dynamics of Caucasians being assembled among tribes and leading these tribes, and they understand that from that standpoint. Now, let's deal with 1682, and I'm going to start in Virginia. I spent the past 10 years studying colonial law as it deals with Native Americans and as it deals with reclassifications of race. So in 1682, Virginia decided to create two acts. In the act that we're going to deal with, Virginia said Native Americans or Indians and Africans will be placed under the umbrella of Negro. I started in Virginia. Negro was a Portuguese term used to describe indigenous people. So in the colonial time in America, you had Indian Negroes and you had African Negroes. Now, South Carolina adapted that and came up with something called the Negro Law of South Carolina. If you go and Google the Negro Law of South Carolina, you will find this congressional record. And it talks about Indians as well as Africans, free people of color, free Africans, free Indians. But what history doesn't also tells you, there were European Negroes, which were British slaves that were in South Carolina colonial time. That's a history not even talked about. So now we're going to go back and we're going to deal with the Indian Negroes who were in slavery. Because what happens today when historians start talking and activists start talking and they're telling about African Americans in the 16, 17, 18, early 1900s, I have an issue with that because who are you talking about? Because that term did not exist. So you have to deal with the definition. So understanding this from a forensic standpoint, Negro in colonial times, you were talking about two different sets of people. You were talking about the Americans, the Indians, and you were talking about the Africans in slavery. And I use the term like mixing fruit cocktails. Because after the slavery, everybody is colored or everybody is black. And please keep in mind, black is not a race. It is a color. It is looked upon as being a race, been accepted as being a race. It is a color. So folks really need to understand this. I deal with my ethnicity of who I am. I am a Yuchi Indian. And my grandmother and my grandaunt and my grandfather and my parents made sure I never forget it. I drank it day in and day out. My aunt will always say, we may be called black, but we didn't come from Africa. We from right here. The Yuchi Indians have been on the Savannah River for over 1,000 years, and the Ogeechee River. Thousands of years. When the first Europeans came and saw us, they say these people have the hue of the Ethiopian and the Egyptian. So what does that say?
So they were comparing.
Folks don't understand because they don't know the history of Native American slavery. And South Carolina, listen to me, brother, listen to me carefully. South Carolina has the most pristine records of Native American slavery and colonial race reclassification than any other state. Now, as I speak tonight, I speak from South Carolina. But keep in mind, Georgia was created out of South Carolina, and Alabama was created out of Georgia. So in the beginning, it was the Carolinas. But a lot of people don't realize, again, that a lot of the Spanish Moors and Morocco, who granted South Carolina their first charter as an independent sovereign state, helped colonize the Carolinas. South Carolina created a law in the 1600s called the Moor Sundry Act. And what this act did, it classified free African as white. So on the census, you got to be very careful, because now I'm speaking to you from a forensic genealogist point of view. Your ancestors, depending on who they are, if you know who they are, may be coded as white on the census when you go back and do your genealogy search, and you think you've got the wrong person. No, you have the right person if you have the location. Majority of them were slave owners. They held property.
What are one of the ways, Alonzo? Is that a reverb on my end?
Yeah, that's an echo.
Let me cut the gain down. What about now? Hello?
Better. Yeah, that's better.
Okay, Alonzo, why is this seems to be one of what you're talking about now seems to be one of the ways that there is so much confusion and animosity in the community by the way you're explaining it. Could that be the reason?
We're not the same people. We never were the same people. We were all combined, those that were slaves, those that were not. So after the end of slavery, let me explain something else about South Carolina. South Carolina, when they came in to enslave, they conquered entire villages. Villages might have 5,000, 10,000 people. Could be 40, 50, 60, maybe 100,000 acres. And those native villages became plantations. And those plantations today are townships and cities. In the early stage of Native American slavery, when they started bringing the Africans over, they didn't enslave them on the same plantation. That only happened at a different time. Native Americans enslaved the whole village. No one's going to run away. Now, what you got to understand, when you go do your research now, you have to look at what type of plantation this was. Was it a cotton plantation? Was it a rice plantation? Or a sugarcane plantation? 98% of your sugar plantations are your Native American slaves. Your cotton plantations are your African slaves. And your rice plantation. You have to investigate the plantation owner because they had to have permits. Did he have a permit to own Native American slaves? Did he have a permit to own African slaves? Or did he have a permit for British slaves? Scottish and your Irish. These things are very key. Now, South Carolina did a whole lot of domestic slave trading with Native Americans, which means many of your ancestors ended up into Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and other places in the West Indies because that was a domestic trade. Well, you say, well, how is that a domestic trade and that's not part of the United States? I'm sorry, because in the 1600s, South Carolina had a governor named Governor Linton, Henry Linton. Henry Linton was the governor of Jamaica and South Carolina and governed certain parts of the Barbados because all of that was a part of the South Carolina province. That's why you won't find any slave trade direction coming from the United States going to the islands. It won't be on the transatlantic slave because it's domestic. So you have to understand that. So as you go do your genealogy search, that is very important. The other thing to keep in mind is to study immigration maps. Where did the slave owner come from? Because in South Carolina had about 274 free African slave owners. So you have to understand, why wasn't this information given? You got to go back and look at Reconstruction. What were they trying to reconstruct? Then after Reconstruction, we get Jim Crow. We get laws that saying coloreds can't read, can't go to school, can't become policemen, can't be judges. Why? So you will go into the public records and find out that before the Civil War, your ancestors may have been landowners. Your ancestors may have been slave owners and not vice versa. Your ancestors may have fathered white children and they were the slave masters, beside it being vice versa. These are things folks need to be concerned about because the average genealogist don't teach this. But I'm telling you this from a forensic standpoint. You look at your slave manifest. Your slave manifests are the logs. It tells you where the slave's going, who owned the slave, what color is the slave. If you read the slave manifest, you will see slaves that are gold, that are yellow, that are black, that are white, that are brown, that are tan. So you need to keep in mind. So just so happened the color black stopped for some reason. You got to keep in mind with that because these things are very, very important. Another thing that I teach and I tell people all the time, you got to be careful with the size of the slave ship. Folks don't really understand. Say, what do you mean by that, Langley? Okay, along the Savannah River, the channels are very narrow. I can swim from one side to the other in probably 2 minutes. So the channel is no more than about 25 or 30 yards. So you're not going to get no ship down there. You're going to get a boat because the draft is not going to carry it. And how many people on the little boat going down there? 25, 30 maybe? It wasn't no 200, 300, not in that area. So you have to question now, where did all these massive ships come from? Not mainland inside of America. No. May have been certain amount of size of ships going to the Caribbean. No. It's impossible. These are facts because if you read the Slave Manifest, it tells you the capacity of the ships, the size of the ships. These things are very, very important. For the cotton trade down in Buford, it tells you. And in Charleston, where are these slaves coming from? Why was cotton so important, Egyptian cotton? Because the Africans knew how to grow it. Wasn't for the Africans, wouldn't be no cotton here. So the British loved cotton. And there were 7 African nations that are listed in South Carolina congressional records that had to do with slavery and participated and sent their people over here as well as other tribes. And they sent people over here, these tribes who knew how to grow cotton, knew how to deal with iron, and very other tasks. These were specialists that they sent over here. You have to understand, slavery had nothing to do with black or white. It had to do with capitalism at that time. Jim Crow made it about black and white and racism. I checked the laws. I looked at the record to see how far when you look to see how many people were hung. In slavery days, the numbers was very low because the slave was your property and they had to have insurance on slaves and their costs. Your African slave was your Rolls Royce. But after slavery and in the years of Jim Crow, hanging and lynching, according to the records, expanded over 500 to 1,000%, depending on where you are. They wasn't trying to kill their slaves. So I have to question certain parts of roots and certain events that happened, because from a scientific perspective and what's in the colonial records, certain events didn't take place. Yes, slavery happened. It did. But the multitude of 5,000, 6,000 people, 400 or 500 people on a big slave ship coming down the Savannah River, no, you can't sit in an airplane for 8 hours without having to get up and stretch. So you mean to tell me you're going to chain someone down in a boat and cross the Atlantic for 4 months and their muscles are not being utilized? And they're going to get off the ship when they arrive and start picking cotton